You found the skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. I'm combining two related videos by ICR into one series all about ICR's take on the fossil record. They are both podcasts, and the first one is Trey and Timothy Cleary. Now I found out about halfway through looking at this video that I had actually already covered this video like 2.5 years ago or something. After consulting with my supporters and comparing what I had done in the previous video, I think this script is still worth it. I have new points, I've gotten better in the past few years, and I think there will be technical improvements too. As a result, I decided to simply continue. I suppose at some point it was inevitable that I'd forget that I had covered a video and then do it again. The second video is specifically about transitional fossils, and it was with Ryan Thomas and Ivana. You may have noticed that I'm spending a lot of time with ICR lately, and I am. For one thing, AIG has switched from mostly doing science to mostly doing bigotry. My audience includes LGBTQ people, as well as friends and family of LGBTQ people, and I'm not going to respond to AIG as if the argument that such people shouldn't be allowed to exist unmolested in public is worth having. Abusing people isn't okay, and AIG is pro-legal and private abuse of such individuals, so I won't engage with them on that. Since that's a huge portion of what they're doing, I'm off to ICR more than before. Besides, ICR has some interesting differences from AIG. For one thing, they reject natural selection, which no one else does near as I can tell, and they argue for a much higher flood boundary, which is in itself interesting to me. Well anyway, here's Trey and Tim.
Today, we're going to talk about fossils. More specifically, the fossil record, not the individuals themselves.
That thing Kent Hovind doesn't think exists, which is always weird to me.
For our viewers and listeners, and maybe me, I could use a refresher. What is the fossil record?
Well, the fossil record is just a collection of all fossils ever discovered.
Yep.
Tim should tell Kent, although ICR likes to mostly not even acknowledge that he exists, and I can't blame them. He's basically the most scandalous guy in creation science there ever has been.
And so it's whatever's been found, they kind of lump it all together in that big term, the fossil record. It's like it's a big book, but it's, a record that you play. Now you youngsters know what records are.
Record has only ever meant vinyl discs for playing music. Moving on past the boomer humor.
Whatever's been discovered around the world as a fossil, we're always adding to the fossil record. We're always finding new discoveries.
Indeed. Through most of the 2020s, the rate of discovery of just dinosaurs has been about one species a week. We're in what may be remembered as a golden age for paleontology. A large part of this is that certain countries are now more open to internationally based paleontological research than they were through most of the 19th and 20th centuries, as a result of advancements in medicine as well as shifting political climates. That's why it seems like every few weeks we find a new almost bird fossil from China. China only recently opened up to cooperation with foreign paleontologists and has started putting money into domestic fossil digs.
And so it's just a collection of all the fossils.
So it's a conglomeration term of everything that's there. All right.
I have a sinking feeling that is the last completely true thing I'll hear from Clary.
That's easy enough. Now, I've heard a number of scientists say that the order in which the fossils are found in this fossil record, that's indicative of, the evolutionary sequence.
In fact, it's so indicative of that, it's kind of the reason evolution was thought up in the first place, and it was done before Darwin. The fact that the fossil record preserves ecosystems that simply no longer exist, full of plants and animals that do not exist today, and that it lacks essentially any recognizable modern form, was perplexing to those who accepted special creation. For one thing, the absence of modern animals was strange, since the impression you generally get from Genesis is that God created all the organisms on Earth in the span of 2 days. Further, if there had been a flood, that might explain the bare existence of fossils, but if God was putting animals on the ark to save them, then where are they? It would seem a bit strange if God saved them simply to let them all die off. In fact, the very concept of extinction didn't exist when the first fossils were found. It wasn't until faunal succession in the fossil record became too obvious to ignore that people started to come around to the idea that God would allow an entire species to go extinct and simply no longer exist at all.
Now, as creationists, we don't hold to that idea.
But they also don't hold to what the Bible says about creation either. Genesis clearly depicts the Earth as being created out of a cosmic ocean with a dome over it to keep out the waters of the ocean above the Earth. This dome is also thought to have openings from which can come rain and snow and other precipitation. The only creationists who are consistently literal in their interpretation of Genesis are the flat Earth creationists. Creationists are in this weird position of not being able to take the Bible as seriously as they say they do, because much of the science they'd be more consistent to reject is too obviously correct to reject. The flavors of creationism mostly differ in how seriously they take a literal interpretation of Genesis 1 through 11, versus how seriously they take observable reality. On the side of taking the most literal interpretation and taking reality the least seriously are flat Earth creationists. Then we get to geocentric globe creationists, then regular young Earth creationists, then old Earth creationists, then intelligent design creationists who are okay with much of evolution and common ancestry, but think that there are some things in life that couldn't have evolved. And finally we get to the theistic and deistic evolutionists, who I would argue don't reject science but simply see a divine hand behind it. Of course, I am not unique in noticing the spectrum of creationists.
But can you talk about that? Are there problems with that?
Well, that's what we're taught in school when I took my geology classes. If you take a geology class or if you're in earth science class in high school or you take a geology class in college, that's what you're going to be told, is that the fossils show evidence of evolution, but they really don't.
I mean, they seem to, they really do, but let's hear them out.
The fossils show sudden appearances, and it's in a term called stasis, which means they stay the same, and then they disappear or extinction. So you see fossils showing up in the fossil record at different levels.
The fossils that show up at different levels seem like prima facie evidence that those organisms didn't exist beforehand, which is kind of a big part of evolution. You know, there's a reason that Darwin's big book is called On the Origin of Species.
And then you see them stay the same for a while, and they disappear.
Uh-oh. I feel like Stephen Jay Gould is coming with some punctuated equilibrium. But yes, most species do not exist in an environment that allows for long-term directional selection. This can be seen simply by looking at the concept of a fitness landscape. A fitness landscape is a 3D graph. The horizontal axes represent morphology and the vertical axis, fitness. So every point on the graph indicates a morphotype and the fitness associated with it. Organisms that are more fit reproduce and their offspring will cluster near them, since organisms tend to produce offspring that are similar to themselves. But because of mutations, the offspring will form a cluster surrounding the parent in different directions. It should be pretty obvious then that populations will always end up moving uphill on the landscape over time. This is natural selection. But what happens when an organism is at a peak, such that all directions are downhill? Well, when that happens, the population will tend to simply stay on that peak and not move down from it because populations can't simply cross valleys just because it might be a good idea. As they go downhill, they reproduce less, and so the local peak is where they hang out. So how can we get long-term change preserved in the fossil record? Well, environments do change. If the peaks shift, then so too will the population. But in order for this to be captured in the fossil record, there must be a very slow shift of the fitness peak. It must not shift back, and it must be relatively steady in pace. Otherwise, a smooth gradient won't be seen. Alternatively, there could be a very shallow sloped ridge that persists for a very long time, such that the population will only slowly climb it, because being lower on the slope is hardly distinguishable from being on a plateau. These situations are unusual, and so we really shouldn't expect to see them reflected in the fossil record very often. But in some cases we do, such as with Neoceratopsians, who have such smooth transitions that the species of the Triceratops genus are almost certainly directly in an ancestor-descendant relationship. This is also true of the extinct aquatic sloth genus, the Lasochnus, and it is even true in some hominin species like Homo erectus and H. sapiens.
And some of them, start just very limited range. Others have a little longer range. Others, are still alive today. We still see fossils of the same things that are supposed to be, millions of years old, and they're exactly the same today.
I would love to know the name of one such species. Creationists like to point to large groups like horseshoe crabs, coelacanths, or in some cases even mammals. Rarely, though, do they give a particular species alive now and in the past, and when they do, it always turns out that the fossil example is not in fact the same species. Or it turns out that the fossil is extremely recent.
And that's a bit of a problem for the evolutionists as well, because why wouldn't everything be constantly evolving and changing?
There are a few reasons. One is that not all evolution shows up in fossils. Fossils preserve mostly hard tissue, that is, biominerals such as bones and shells. If evolution happens to change soft tissue, that's much harder to detect, although not strictly impossible. Further, think back to the fitness landscape. If you are on a peak and that peak persists, and in fact, you will be experiencing purifying selection, that is, selection to keep the species the same. When organisms go extinct, it's often because their environment, and hence fitness landscape, changes too fast for them to adapt, which on its own means we're likely to see a fairly sudden exit from the fossil record.
Why do we see things that theoretically in their world 500 million years old or 400 million years old, and yet they're still alive today?
Bullshit. No species from 400 to 500 million years ago is alive today. Not a single one. I challenge Clary to make the case for any extant species being the same species as any fossil taxon dated by scientists as having lived 400 to 500 million years ago.
Yeah.
And so some of these things are a little bit odd. It doesn't really fit the story that they're selling to everybody, but unfortunately they have the microphone, literally.
Oh, they literally have the microphone, huh? Hey Tim, what's that there in front of your lying mouth? It's some kind of long black object. Looks like a motherfucking microphone to me. The idea that creationists are ignored because they lack access to the tools needed to spread their message is laughable. Answers in Genesis got together millions of dollars to get a building shaped like their idea of Noah's Ark built. Christian broadcasting reaches most corners of the United States. Christian radio does the same. There are constantly people trying to sneak creationism into public schools. Republican candidates are basically required to at least pretend to be doubtful of a whole swath of science, including climatology and evolution, but even getting into medicine, paleontology, etc. Now, I certainly don't think all Republican voters or politicians actually deny that much science, but they tend to at least pretend to, just to pander to Clary's target audience. Clary has a bigger microphone than virtually any scientist. Most scientists have literally no microphone at all. They're just names on papers, and not the lead name either. The reason no one takes Clary's ideas seriously is because they're not serious ideas.
And so they can tell people what they want.
People near as I can tell don't want evolution in the abstract. They want to know about the world. I don't really like evolution in the abstract. Don't get me wrong, I don't dislike it in the abstract either. What I like is knowing about the world. I like biology. So I like to know about that aspect of the world. The reason I spend time learning about evolution and paleontology is because it is, by all appearances, how certain parts of the world I happen to really like work. I don't care one way or the other what it does to Clary's theology, because, spoilers, I don't give two shits about Clary's theology. I don't go to Clary's church, and I don't want to.
But to me, the fossil record shows sudden appearance, stasis it's called, staying the same, and then disappearance.
Except that it doesn't. At least, not above the species level. This tendency to find sudden appearance and stasis followed by extinction is only apparent at the level of species. For example, we probably won't find fossils linking wolves and coyotes or golden jackals. But do we have fossils linking, say, wolves with their common ancestor with bears? Why, yes. We have animals like Meiosis, Amphicyon, and Hesperocyon. Transitionals above the level of species are abundant in the fossil record. This odd trend of a few, although not no, species-level transitions, but abundant transitions at the family level and above, is because of various well-understood aspects of population genetics, things like the founder effect and the relative strength of genetic drift, and the dependency of time to fixation on overall population size, and the rate of change in environments. Let's take a look at time to fixation. When an allele fixes, that means that all of the population has it. Now, alleles can spread as a result of either natural selection or genetic drift. In either case, there is a stochastic element involved. But let's say you had two scenarios, one for drift and the other for natural selection. We use dice to keep things simple. So scenario 1 is a large population. You have 1 million ordinary 6-sided dice, and you roll all of them, hoping to get all 6s. You're not going to get them. But let's say that for every 6 you roll, you get to re-roll it, and if it's a 6 again, you can put it aside, and then with those, you do another round of rolls, and if it's a 6 again, it gets to just stay a 6 for the next round. Well, eventually, you will get all 6s. Indeed, in the first round, you'll get more than 4.6 thousand sixes that get to stick around to the next time. But in the next round, those sixes will have to go through the need to roll boxcars again to stay sixes. Clearly, this will take a very long, but not infinite amount of time. Each time you'll have more sixes than before, and a slightly larger pool of sixes will be around. Now, of course, this is vastly simplified, and technically isn't drift, but weak selection, but it's just illustrative of the effect of population size. Now let's try, say, a smaller population size. Say you only have 100 dice. Well, in this case, every six that gets to stick around is now a much higher proportion of the dice, and so will have a much bigger impact. Further, you're much more likely to get a larger portion than 1/6 as sixes in a given roll because of the law of large numbers, meaning that you're more likely by fluke to greatly increase the number of sixes you have in a generation. Now let's change it to some strong selection. In this case, the sixes only need to go through one subsequent round of rolls to stick around. So the selection is 6 times stronger. Clearly, this will reduce the amount of time it takes to get all sixes, generally by a magnitude of 6 times. But still, it's faster in the lower population, or the smaller number of dice. But what would that look like in the fossil record? Well, organisms with big populations would be more likely to fossilize, so we should see more fossils from species that have large populations than from species with small populations. But those are exactly the species that change the slowest. Conversely, the rapidly changing species are those that are small in population, and so have fewer, if any, fossils. But because this phenomenon is most apparent right at the species level, where small subpopulations go off to found new species that at least start with small populations, and thus with a rapid pace of evolution, it should be hard to find species-level transitions, and it is. But this doesn't mean anything for the transition between what we now consider families, orders, or classes, and at those levels, transitional fossils are actually quite abundant. It's a similar sort of problem to the fact that the universe should be uniform according to the Big Bang, but it sure doesn't look uniform when I look around. But the thing is that at larger and larger scales, it tends to look more and more uniform. The scale of the thing you're looking at matters, because not all processes are scale invariant. Evolution is not scale invariant.
And that reflects the global flood.
Okay.
All right, let's see it.
Well, at this point in time, you do have a microphone, so now's the time to use it.
That's right.
Wait, you mean they both know they're not being censored or silenced? Well, that's cool. I wish they'd stop complaining about it then.
You mentioned this briefly. You mentioned the flood. So my next question is, where did all these fossils come from, and why are they in the order they're in? How did they get there?
I would contend that since neither ecological zonation nor hydrodynamic sorting can explain the order, that the flood simply can't explain it. But let's see what Clary says. I'm sure I'll have specific reasons to his specific answer.
If you read the literature, you're listening to the stories that are being taught by the evolutionary scientists, they'll tell you we evolved from, marine animals.
Mm-hmm.
There's no need to reference what other people think. Explain how the flood resulted in the ordering of the fossils. There's no need to reference what other people think on this at all. First, just like it's always pointless when flat earthers point out things that they think are problems for the globe without ever actually providing their own explanations, starting with how real science came to its conclusions doesn't help the flood model. It's pointless at this time when the goal is to provide evidence for the flood model.
But that's what we see being buried first in the flood. My research has been showing that as the flood progressed, it didn't flood everything right away. It took 150 days, the Bible says, to get to the high point. So as it progressed along, initially what it flooded was these shallow marine areas, which were pretty extensive in the pre-flood world, it looks like.
So we should see both extinct and extant common shallow marine animals. Like lobsters, stingrays, flounders, maybe the occasional seabird or aquatic mammal like a seal, right? But we don't. I'd be willing to buy the reason that we only see things like trilobites low in the geological record is that they were buried first. But that would also mean that we should see other animals that inhabit the same habitats but that are still alive. Yet, we don't. Where are they? Even bivalves, one of the most common shallow marine animal groups around, and one of the easiest to preserve in the fossil record, don't show up until about midway into the Cambrian, and they're even preceded by Halkieria, an animal that sure looks like a proto-bivalve, but which clearly isn't an actual bivalve. We'll probably be seeing more problems with the idea of ecological zonation, which is essentially what Clary is going with here.
And so you're going to naturally get marine fossils first.
Right, and I'm not disputing that that's a reasonable conclusion. It's just that we can make much more detailed predictions than that, and those predictions don't seem to be borne out.
And as you work your way up, eventually you start flooding the land, you start getting land animals.
Yeah, but we're also getting the sea animals too, and the modern ones. Why are the whales and clams found in the highest layers in the geological column? Are there high elevation whales? That seems like it would be impossible. Water, as you probably know, flows downhill, and over large scales, rocks are not impermeable to water. Water flows through rocks. In fact, this large-scale permeability is part of why wells work, and why the water table can be higher than sea level in places. Combined, this means that we really can't have high-elevation oceans for very long, and even the biggest lakes are not at the top of mountains. With Lake Chad at 282 meters in elevation, only a tenth the elevation of the fairly modest Appalachian Mountains in the United States, which reach about 2 kilometers in height. It's an elevation that's dwarfed by the Rockies, which get to some 4.4 kilometers above sea level, and even more so by the Himalayas, which get to 8.8 kilometers high. But Clary here is saying that the top levels of the geologic column were laid down as the flood was flooding the tallest mountains. How could such waters possibly be still catching marine organisms like clams that are sessile? At least with whales we have the excuse that maybe they swam to the mountains that were then underwater. But clams don't have that option. They aren't exactly known for their speed. How did clams get into Cretaceous and Paleogene fossil layers?
So we didn't evolve and crawl out of the sea. It's just a bad story.
Yes, because mountain climbing clams are a better story. That checks out.
That has no basis for it, because what we see in the fossils is they stay the same.
Well, if I were being uncharitable, I'd interpret that as a statement that individual fossils stay the same, which is largely true, but I know he means that fossil taxa stay the same throughout their vertical extent. First, that's not always true in the first place. That's why we have the phenomenon of chronospecies, that is, species that are named because they are different at different points in time, but for which we have continuous fossil records showing gradual anagenetic evolution. But second, even in cases where this is true, it again really only applies at the species level. But if you want to, say, trace the evolution of humans from the first chordates, you see a lot of change which tends to line up quite well with deep time and evolution. Also, if you don't like yodeling, maybe this isn't the series for you.
And then you suddenly see something else above them, and you see something else above that.
Yeah, usually more derived members of lineages you saw lower down, which isn't well explained by ecological zonation. In fact, ecological zonation only even attempts to explain why life is increasingly terrestrial in higher parts of the record. It doesn't even attempt to explain the pattern of derivation of morphology, that is, independent of habitat, and seen in fossils anyway. Tiktaalik was a shallow water animal, yet it's found above our earliest shallow water coastal or lacustrine environments. Instead, we find things like Secabambapsis, a jawless, mostly limbless fish, if it can even be called that, in lower strata. Why are vertebrate fossils sorted by whether or not they have jaws? Ecological zonation isn't going to help with that.
And so it's really just a record of the water, what we call ecological zones, ecological zonation.
Hey, he did it! He said the thing!
As you go through these different environments, starting with the marine, and eventually you get to the coastal areas, and you get to higher areas and higher ground areas. The land animals change, the plants change because you're going higher and higher in elevation.
Meet the water lily. It's an aquatic flowering plant that roots underwater, floats leaves at the surface for photosynthesis, and also blooms above the surface. Like its habitat is low elevation, the water lily is a low elevation organism. You don't see many of them on high elevation alpine lakes. The reason I am talking about it though is that it's an angiosperm. Angiosperms are today by far the most common plants. They are the flowering plants. Virtually every plant you're familiar with is an angiosperm. The only other plants you're likely to encounter most days that aren't flowering plants are ferns, pine trees, moss, and depending on where you live, maybe ginkgo trees. But the problem is that flowering plants don't show up in the fossil record until the early Cretaceous. But according to ecological zonation, things that don't show up until the early Cretaceous should be things that live at higher elevation. So, where are the Triassic lily pads? Heck, where are the Devonian or Silurian lily pads? Or for that matter, frogs, alligators, skunk cabbage, mangrove, snakes, ducks, geese, and catfish? Why are none of these animals found in the Devonian or Silurian, when the flood is allegedly just coming onto land in the lowest areas? The fact is that ecological zonation only works if you don't think about it, like most of Flat Earth. One thing that does work, no matter how much you think about it, is becoming a member here on the channel. There's a join button right below this video, and it starts at only $1.99 a month. You get early access to videos like this, as well as access to my super secret Discord server, and even a few member-only videos. You also get access to channel emojis and one membership chat a month for my live streams.
So it's really just the order of burial in the flood.
Interesting. So where are the Cambrian sea turtles? And yes, the more he just says that without any attempt to actually explain how that works at anything other than the most superficial level, I will add more low-elevation organisms that we simply do not find in the Paleozoic.
Fascinating. And that totally makes sense as to why, like, I forget the exact number, but like 95% of fossils are marine fossils, right?
Right.
No, the explanation is much simpler. Most sediment is waterborne, and so water deposited. And so aquatic environments are more likely to be represented in sedimentary rocks. And the largest such environments that are likely to not be subducted are coastal marine environments. So that's the most abundant kind of sedimentary rock. What situation could possibly make terrestrial preservation more common?
Even T-Rexes found in Montana are found mixed with sharks. There's 6 different species of sharks in the Hell Creek Formation where they found Tyrannosaurus rex sioux and most of their T-Rexes.
I can't actually find any evidence of that. The Hell Creek Formation, which is the formation that has Tyrannosaurus rex in Montana, does include at least 6 different shark genera. In fact, some 60% or so of the fossils in that formation are shark fossils. In part because sharks drop teeth like a Reddit mod drops Cheeto dust. But as a formation, it's made up of various members. Each member is itself part of the upper or lower Hell Creek. Each member is a distinct collection of strata. A way to think of it is that a formation is made of members, which are made of strata, which themselves are often made of laminae. So are there T-Rex fossils found in the same stratum as shark teeth? I mean, maybe. T-Rex, I'm sure, spent some time in brackish water with sharks in it, since the Hell Creek is mostly a lowland area dominated by wetlands and sequoia forests, that sloped down to the sea in the form of the Western Interior Seaway, that at that time divided North America into Laramidia in the west and Appalachia in the east. But I also can't actually find any reports of that, and the fact that sharks and T-Rex are both found in the formation isn't an indication of anything catastrophic, or even them living in the same place.
And lots of other marine fossils as well.
Yep, mosasaurs, sea turtles, sturgeons, coelacanths, gar, clams, crocodiles, alligators, and boas are among the many aquatic and often marine animals in the Hell Creek. But notice how even here it doesn't really work. We still don't have any modern low-elevation organisms like the aforementioned lilies or any other aquatic angiosperms really, since at this time the landscape is still dominated by gymnosperms and ferns.
And we even find dinosaurs in marine rocks.
Fun fact, marine rocks are not flood rocks. Those terms aren't synonymous, and land animals, especially those that live near the sea, like Tyrannosaurus, sometimes end up in the ocean. Did you know that a major predator of moose is the orca? Now, I'm not saying that Tyrannosaurus was out foraging in the ocean, but it certainly swam sometimes, and could also be swept out to sea by storms, local floods, or just dying and rolling into a river. Clary is just looking at perfectly normal things that happen all the time, and then saying that, nope, this time it needs a miracle to explain it. This is no more reasonable than saying that the only reason Trey has a clean shirt is because laundry fairies must have cleaned it magically for him, and ignoring the fact that people launder shirts all the time without the help of laundry fairies. Similarly, the existence of a terrestrial organism's body in the ocean doesn't require a magical flood, since it happens all the time without magical floods.
And the research, as I go around from continent to continent, I see this pattern everywhere. Europe, almost all their Cretaceous fossils are found in marine rocks.
Well, given that Europe was basically a bunch of islands during the Cretaceous, that's not surprising. But that's also not true for Triassic Europe, which should be even more marine according to Clary, but it's less marine. What's Clary's explanation for that? I don't think he has one. I think he's just going to cherry-pick Cretaceous Europe, which was a period when Europe was more underwater than it was during most of the Phanerozoic, which means, yeah, Europe actually contradicts this model of becoming more terrestrial as you go up the column. It actually starts out mostly terrestrial, then it gets more and more marine until in the Cretaceous it's mostly shallow sea. Then throughout the Cenozoic it gets less marine again. At every stage, every single example that Clary gives of how ecological zonation is supposed to explain the fossil record fails. And it does it in ways that are very obvious if you're even passingly familiar with the fossil-bearing strata of the locale he's talking about. Of course, he relies on the fact that most people aren't familiar with it, because most people aren't paleontology nerds. But still, that's the reason no one takes him seriously. It's not because he doesn't have access to a microphone, like he whined about earlier. It's because this idea doesn't even pass the sniff test. All that's needed to refute it is to just look at a list of what fossil taxa are found where. That's it.
They're found in limestones and chalk.
Well, first, chalk is a form of limestone, so yeah, the reason the Cretaceous is named that is because of all the Cretaceous chalk found in Europe. Because it was underwater. Chalk in Latin is creta, and so Cretaceous means chalky. But chalk forms fastest in calm, warm, and slightly acidic water. It basically can't form in a flood. It's physically impossible. Further, this is biogenic limestone. That means it's physically composed of the skeletons of trillions upon trillions of tiny organisms, and these organisms are photosynthetic organisms. That means that all of them, when they were alive, had to be near the top of the water in order to actually photosynthesize. According to Clary, they all have to have been alive during the flood, but there isn't enough space on the planet for all the biogenic limestone to have been living organisms during that time. The ocean would just be a sludge of phytoplankton unable to photosynthesize, yet somehow kept alive against the laws of nature by a cruel god, who will only have mercy on them by killing them in a global flood. Once again, every instance he picks as being explained by the flood actually shows why the flood is impossible.
And so the secular story has to be, well, they got washed out to sea. But animals that wash out to sea, they don't survive.
Well, since they're fossils, yeah, they didn't survive. Like, that seems obvious. If it's a fossil, it's not currently alive, so I'm not sure why this is a problem.
Right.
They get eaten.
Scavenged.
They get scavenged, and then they decay away. What's left of them?
Well, that is the most likely outcome, hence why fossils are rare, but rare outcomes occur. The chance of rolling all sixes on 10 six-sided dice is one roll in 60,466,176. But if you had 8 billion humans do it, about 132 of them will actually get all sixes. Sure, that's not a lot, but it's also not none. Similarly, while the chances of any given organism that's in the ocean, terrestrial or not, being preserved as a fossil are quite small, given the enormous number of such animals who have ever lived and died, it should not be surprising that some of them have been preserved. Additionally, not all parts of the ocean are the same. For example, the famous Solnhofen Lagerstätte is marine biogenic limestone from an anoxic marine lagoon. The kind of place where being quickly devoured as a fresh animal body is actually pretty unlikely.
And so we even found one dinosaur washed out to sea off Norway, 70 miles offshore.
Clary either didn't actually bother to look into this, or he's just lying. This dinosaur was not washed out to sea. It's the Plateosaurus described in a 2006 paper, A Late Triassic Dinosaur Bone Offshore Norway, by Jorn Harald Hørum et al., published in the Norwegian Journal of Geology. The second section of the paper is geological framework, and the second is location, depositional environment, and age. It is here that we find the fossil was from a reddish-brown mudstone member of the Lunde Formation, a fluvial formation from a semi-arid environment that preserves paleosols similar to those that currently form in semi-arid environments with long dry periods from 4 to 8 months. Clary knows this, but marine sedimentary rocks are not rocks found in the sea, but rocks formed in the sea, and these are not marine rocks. This dinosaur was not washed out to sea. Further, the formation is full of paleosols, that is, preserved soil layers. The problem for Clary is that paleosols can't be preserved if the sediment they're made of is broken up. They have to be preserved in situ in order to remain a paleosol. And further, soil takes years to form, not weeks or months, meaning that they cannot form during a year-long flood. So no, this animal wasn't washed out to sea, and further, the rock it was found in precludes a flood as its cause. On its own, this fossil means that the formation in question isn't flood rock, and Clary's entire idea of the rocks of Earth from the beginning of the Phanerozoic until sometime in the Cenozoic being flood rock is absolutely precluded by the data as they stand now. I look forward to Clary's experiment in rapid soil formation to contest these data, although I won't hold my breath.
And they drilled an oil well in the North Sea 1.5 miles down. They pulled up a core, which is just a few inches around, and in it they had a dinosaur bone that they could identify. The actual species of dinosaur, a Plateosaurus.
That's true.
70 miles offshore. So these waves were coming in, not only burying things and mixing marine fossils with the land animals, they're also washing some of the land animals, probably many of them, back out.
Then why isn't this dinosaur in marine sediment? In fact, I can't find any mention of marine organisms in the Lunda Formation. Now, to be fair, that's in the middle of the North Sea, and is of primarily economic and not scientific interest at present, so it isn't well characterized in terms of paleobiota. So maybe there are marine fossils preserved, although I'm a bit skeptical given the origin of the rocks. But unless Tim has a secret source he's not sharing, I think he's making up these marine organisms buried with the Plateosaurus.
Just out to sea, just like you'd expect to see. We see this with the tsunami waves. They come in,
Right.
and they go back out. And unfortunately, people are killed because tsunamis, are very, very deadly and very, very fast. And that's kind of what we think the flood was like, these huge tsunami waves that kept coming in and burying things.
Okay, I'm glad Clary has an internal picture of his little fantasy. But back here on planet Real Life, Real Earth, his last example not only fails to support his idea, but flatly precludes it, making this a Trojan source. Or at least it would have been one had he bothered to actually cite the source. No amount of storytelling will overcome the bare fact that the rocks he needs to be marine aren't, and the rocks he needs to be catastrophically deposited cannot have been. Even if his story were physically possible, which it's not because of, among other things, the heat problem, which to date has not been solved, it wouldn't matter because the actual rocks that exist here in the present, where we can observe them, cannot, as far as we know, have been formed in a manner consistent with his story. The only way for this to change is for creationists to do the one thing they really don't like doing: actual science. Do the sedimentation, soil formation, permineralization, and lithification experiments. They think all this stuff can happen in just over a year, so it's not like the experiments would take too long. Set one up now, and in fewer than 2 years, you could have published results. Heck, since it's a real experiment, it could even probably be published in a real journal, rather than the blogs with strict formatting requirements that pass themselves off as peer-reviewed journals among creationists.
And that's what kind of created the fossil record. So there's an order to the fossil record.
There sure is an order to the fossil record, but both this order and the details of the rocks the fossils are found in tend to refute a global flood sorting things by ecological zonation. We're not even halfway through this talk, and already Clary has referenced enough geology to show that his idea is completely impossible. That level of incompetence is frankly impressive. If he's not incompetent, then the only conclusion I can think of is that his audience is, and that they won't bother to check on anything he says.
But it's the order of burial in the flood.
Hey, this is Quetzalcoatlus, a pterosaur, the kind of thing that can always fly to higher elevation to avoid floodwaters. Why is it buried lower than most birds? Why couldn't it fly to higher elevation like its fellow Ophote, if we're going to use the term from Genesis? Heck, why aren't ostriches found below it? They can't even fly. Oh no, once again a specific example that doesn't actually make sense in terms of ecological zonation, meaning that yet again, it fails to actually explain the ordering of the fossils.
And we see that matched up, continent to continent. We see the same pattern everywhere I look.
Which pattern? Dinosaurs being buried in rivers among soils that couldn't possibly form under a flood? Yep, I'll agree, that sure is a worldwide pattern.
The same story is there. So there is kind of a true geologic column, a global column that's...
If only he could convince Kent Hovind of that.
Not complete in many places because different waves came in at different times, but that's what gave us the fossil record.
And the waves also allow for some mixing of those fossils.
Right. And some of those waves, as they transport back, of course, you're going to destroy environments, and then suddenly you're going to have completely different animals above it, and that's going to look like what secular scientists or evolutionists call extinctions.
So hold up. The reason that, say, Gorgonopsids don't show up in the Triassic is that the Triassic fossils, apparently, even the characteristic marine fossils somehow, all lived above a particular hard elevation line. But the Permian fossils, again including marine ones, all lived lower than that. So there was some elevation above which Gorgonops could not go, and below which Rausuchus could not go. How the f*** does that work? What prevents these animals from moving? Why do we see a changeover in the marine life as well as the terrestrial life at the end of the Permian, when some 90% of all lineages disappear from the fossil record, both on land and in the sea? What keeps these different faunal assemblages separate at different elevations? Why are Triassic deserts so separate from Permian deserts? They generally preserved one on top of the other, between the late Permian and early Triassic. This requires an explanation, because this is not what we would normally expect. So why should we think that these highly segregated ecological zones are even possible, never mind actually historical?
So they have about 5 major extinctions through the rock record where they think, something happened, like an asteroid hit.
I mean, they only say that because of things like finding the crater, associated tektites at the right age on about half of the planet closest to the impact, and a global iridium-rich layer, which cannot be accounted for by any other known mechanism. That's about as conclusive as it possibly could be that an asteroid hit the Earth sometime around 66 million years ago.
Or some other story they have to come up with to explain why suddenly things changed dramatically.
I like how he says some other story, as if the stories aren't actually well evidenced. Like we don't actually have the flood basalts from the Siberian from the end of the Permian, and as if we don't know what volcanic activity does to the chemistry of the ocean and atmosphere. Scientists didn't make up that basalt. It exists. You can go touch it. You can bring samples to a lab. Let me know when Clary or any other wrong earther can do that with the Ark. The level of projection on display here is frankly astounding.
And many animals disappear, but really what that shows is that these environments are now completely inundated globally. So the entire ecosystem at that level is now gone as the water went higher and higher.
But ecosystems don't work that way. Like, climb a mountain. Just go do it. Pause the video, go climb a mountain, and come back. Or failing that, just imagine the last time you went up a mountain, whether on foot or in a vehicle. There were changes by elevation in the flora and fauna, of course, but did they come in hard lines? No. Even the famous tree line is actually the result of a gradual shift to smaller and smaller tree sizes before finally there are no more trees. The location of animals is even less well defined by elevation. Life doesn't arrange itself like contour lines on a map, and during some kind of crazy catastrophe, animals are likely to exit their normal habitat seeking safety, which means that we should expect some of the Gorgonops boys to run uphill a bit, maybe even to the Trypanosaurus high forests. This is even worse with flying creatures like bats, pterosaurs, most insects, and birds. They are rarely restricted to habitats based on elevation, because changing elevation is kind of the whole point of flying. You can, for example, find ducks around water at basically any elevation. Why did ducks first show up in the fossil record in the early Oligocene in South America, but say Lassodromenes, another group of flying animals from South America, show up in the early Cretaceous but don't make it out of the Cretaceous? What about this group of flyers made them so much worse at flying up than ducks?
And now you have a completely different ecosystem above it.
Which isn't how ecosystems work, but okay.
Yeah. And you occasionally get one or two of the same animals, but that's where the dinosaurs disappear. The extinction of the dinosaurs is supposed to be from an asteroid, but...
It's supposed because we have the crater. It's right there, full of shock quartz and breccia, the kind of things asteroid impacts make.
The research I did, collecting my columns and oil well data across Mexico where this is supposed to hit, the Yucatan area, to me, there's not enough melt in the rocks to be a big asteroid, and there's not even enough what they call iridium, which is this rare earth element that's supposed to come out of, when asteroids hit, they send a dust cloud of iridium out.
Where to even start? First, I want to say I don't contest whatever findings Clary claims. Obviously, I suspect there's a better than average chance that he's just lying, since that's pretty common with creationist PhDs, but whether or not he is just doesn't make a difference. First, in the 1980s, the Alvarez team gave more than enough evidence of a paleo crater in the Gulf of Mexico around the location of the Yucatan Peninsula, and subsequent studies have only confirmed this. Clary hasn't published anything in any actual journal that would even contest this. So basically, when he says there isn't enough melt in his own samples, that's just the same as a flurf saying no when confronted with the fact that the sun sets and doesn't shrink as it moves away from you over a flat Earth. As far as iridium goes, first I want to point out that the global iridium layer isn't found in every single place on Earth. Obviously, there are places where the deposits from the asteroid impact have eroded away, and so no longer exist in a coherent layer. Think about it this way. McDonald's is a global corporation, but that doesn't mean that they can be found in every city on Earth. In fact, they can't even be found in every country, but they can be found all over the place and aren't restricted to some specific portion of the globe. Being global means they can be found anywhere, but not necessarily everywhere. Similarly, the iridium layer can be found all over the world, but not in every single location. But reported places I found after a single Google Scholar search include New Jersey, Kazakhstan, Guangdong Province in China, eastern Bulgaria, and many other locations. In each case, it's associated with a transition from Cretaceous to Paleogene rocks, which itself is associated with a transition from dinosaur-dominated megafauna to the Paleogene, with a combination of mammals, squamates, birds, and crocodilians as the dominant megafauna. Also, lots of frogs. For some reason, the Paleogene comes with an explosion of frog diversity. So whatever flood model Clary posits has to explain why there's a crater off the coast of Mexico and how a very thin but very noticeable layer of iridium was deposited all over the world. Nothing about a global flood would reasonably cause either, so he needs some kind of explanation, and yet he just denies the evidence. You may remember that creationists often like to say that they and scientists have the same evidence, but different interpretations. Clary is ignoring nearly all the evidence and showing that that statement is just not true.
But there's not much iridium there. Only 2, I think, of the 10 or 12 wells show any iridium. So,
cool. Clary found some places that didn't have the iridium layer. That doesn't magically make it disappear from the rest of the world. If I tell you that I have a cactus growing in my yard, you telling me that you don't have one in yours doesn't really do anything to change the one in my yard. That's all Clary is doing. The world over, geologists are finding a layer that is extremely rich in iridium compared to other parts of the rock layers of the Earth. And Clary is sitting here telling us that in the 6 places he looked, he didn't find it in 4 of them. Okay, sure, I won't contest that, although I don't believe him. But, so what?
to me, I don't know if there really was much of an asteroid impact there.
Well, it's not exactly a surprise that a wrong Earther would deny reality.
Just seems kind of like a story.
But that's the stories they have. They have to tell these stories because they have no way to explain them.
Yeah, it's just a story. You know, a story with overwhelming physical evidence. Whereas what they have is a story with overwhelming physical evidence that it's physically impossible as they tell it. Something they themselves admit, because let's not forget that when a bunch of young Earth creationists got together to form the RATE team, or Radioisotopes in the Age of the Earth team, they concluded the amount of heat that their models would unleash during the flood year would be enough to boil the oceans many times over and melt the crust of the Earth. Indeed, if you include all the heat sources young Earth creationists propose, it's not clear that the Earth could even survive, since it seems that the total energy is above the gravitational binding energy of the whole Earth, and the flood would be less like a bunch of water drowning everyone, and more like the Death Star shooting the planet. So yeah, let's call the asteroid hypothesis with the iridium layer, the tektites, the shock quartz, and the breccia lining up exactly with a huge turnover in the paleobiota in the fossil record just a story. But what then do we call the physically impossible actual literary story in the ancient Iron Age book? Because if the asteroid is just a story, then I've got bad news for the flood believers.
Wow.
And even some of the paleontologists don't believe that story. Some of them say, well, how did the frogs survive? Because they have frog fossils that go right across that boundary.
No, we don't. I'm not aware of a single fossil that spans the KPG boundary. But yeah, what about frogs? Well, we don't know for sure, but there seems to be a strong correlation between being an animal that can burrow or live in water and survive in the event. Frogs happen to often be in both categories, so really, they're pretty high up on the list of likely survivors. Now, this is somewhat countered by the fact that their porous skin makes them extremely susceptible to pollution, and the asteroid probably caused plenty of that. But also, no one is doubtful that an asteroid hit because frogs lived. In fact, there really isn't any debate left in the scientific community. The impact at the end of the Cretaceous is about as certain as anything can be and has essentially universal assent. What is less agreed upon is the degree to which that was the direct cause of the extinction at the end of the Cretaceous, with the Deccan Traps, a formation of flood basalt that also happened around the same time, being seen as another possible culprit. Another option is it was a combination of the two. What isn't an option is that either the flood basalt eruptions or the asteroid impact just didn't happen.
And, frogs should have been affected by all this acid rain and all these other effects of a major asteroid impact, but they weren't.
Says who? Just because frog diversity jumps up quickly in the Paleogene doesn't mean that they didn't suffer from the end of the Cretaceous, just that they were some of the first to recover afterwards, and for that reason also had a lot of opportunity to have adaptive radiations before other lineages could catch up. That doesn't indicate that frogs were unaffected. That's just a claim. There's no evidence of it.
And so, they still push this asteroid.
Yeah, much like how the cops will stand there with a body they found in the woods with stab wounds consistent with the bloody knife they found a few meters away, and just keep pushing the murder hypothesis. What weirdos. One group of people who wouldn't just ignore obvious evidence about the past for stupid philosophical reasons are my subscribers. So why not subscribe and then hit the bell icon to turn on all notifications? It's free and reversible. Also, while you're doing that, please hit like, as it's one of the only ways that YouTube will help the channel grow.
Many kids will come to ICR's Discovery Center and they'll talk about, oh, the asteroid wiped out the dinosaurs. I'm like, no, not really.
Yeah, then Clary pulls them aside to lie to them. You gotta make sure they believe your conspiracy theory early, because then they'll be less likely to abandon it when they get old enough for their brains to be fully functional.
I am fully functional.
That's not at all deeply unethical and disgusting behavior.
That's, the flood buried a lot of them, but the dinosaurs didn't go extinct until after the flood.
Right.
Produce modern non-avian dinosaur remains or shut the f*** up.
Because they got off the Ark, like all the other animals that got on the Ark.
Is that the Ark that somehow survived the entire planet being given the Alderaan treatment and turning into an expanding cloud of plasma, at least according to Clary's own flood models? That Ark?
They eventually went extinct in the last probably century or 1,000 years, a couple thousand years.
So there were dinosaurs running around at the time of Jesus that weren't birds. I'm sure there's a body associated with these, right? Will we get the archaeological dig where some chieftain or princess was buried with a Tyrannosaurus skull? Or Stegosaurus spike? Or something? No, we won't? How odd. I wonder what evidence will be given then. Surely not just stories, because as we all know, Clary isn't impressed by stories like the one about the asteroid impact.
Not the last century, the last 500 to 1,000 years.
So maybe the last century, the last 500 years, the last 1,000 years, or the last 2,000 years. Seems like Clary is just making things up.
Fascinating.
Fascinating.
So actually that brings me to another point. We had talked in a previous episode about the flood year and about those sequences. It's interesting that not only are the sequences in the rock, they're in the fossils as well, as they were buried by the flood.
I'm sure it's interesting, especially in that ecological zonation does such a bad job of explaining anything about the ordering of organisms in the fossil record, that every single time Clary pretends it can work, I can come up with an organism that shows it doesn't work at all, and it's completely incoherent.
We've heard of the term missing link before and all of that.
Missing link is a charged and misleading term. No one should use it. The term I would prefer is transitional form or transitional fossil.
And I don't want to dive too deep into this, but let's just talk about it a little bit. What about transitional fossils?
Right.
You know what? Props to Trey for getting it right. I didn't expect him to, but I'm pleasantly surprised, and I give credit where it's due.
The transitional fossils are supposed to be those, fossils where when animals
It's not just animals, it's any organism.
slowly turning into another. And that was Darwin's original idea. And he said there should be millions of transitional fossils all over. And at his, 1859, he said, well, we just haven't found enough fossils yet.
Yes, that is what he said in 1859. But what did he say in 1876, 5 editions later? Oh, he actually noted that geologists were coming around on the basis of more fossils having been found. Indeed, that's 15 years after Archaeopteryx was found, and confirmed previous speculation that there was a connection between dinosaurs and birds. Why do you think Clary is only referencing the 1859 first edition and ignoring the final 1876 edition? It couldn't be because if he did cite the last edition, then the pessimism about the fossil record was largely gone, and transitional forms had been found, could it? That would seem at least questionably honest if that were the answer. But then if Clary simply didn't know that there was more than one edition that was published, is he commenting on the contents of a book with which he's unfamiliar? That also seems less than honest. Is he just too stupid to know that it had more than one edition? You tell me in the comments. Is Clary a liar or an idiot?
We'll fill those pieces in, but we never have. 160 years later, we still haven't found any indisputable transitional fossil.
I'm sure that Clary would dispute them, but he's already been shown to be someone who just denies reality, so who cares?
There's a few that they pull out and say, well, this is kind of a transitional one, but then more people study it and they realize it's really not.
Like what? You notice how he doesn't give a single example? That's because he can't. Even some of the examples that might be reasonable, like Darwinius, are still transitional, just not the way they were initially thought to be. In that case, it was thought that Darwinius was closer to dry-nosed than wet-nosed primates, but it turns out the opposite was true, and it still lacks the features common to all extant wet-nosed primates, and so it remains transitional. Another oft-cited transitional creationists like to pretend doesn't count is Archaeopteryx, which not even Alan Fiducia thinks is not transitional. He just thinks it's transitional between some non-dinosaur group of archosaurs and modern birds.
And so even the evolutionary or the secular community disagrees on, the few that they have, you can count them pretty much on two hands. "76 if you don't count archaic Homo sapiens. And that's just the transitional species that I could easily get good fossil pictures of. It's far from all of them, and there's really no controversy over whether these are transitional. Although there is controversy about exactly how closely related they are to various other extinct organisms and modern organisms. But they all still show basal traits lost in later groups as well as derived traits of those later groups, but not all of them. It's hard to imagine a more incorrect statement about the fossil record than that there are so few transitional species that you could count them on just your fingers without running out of fingers. And that even then they're contentious. Clary knows better. He's just lying. That they try to point to occasionally, but even those are all disputed.
But by and large, they're not disputed as transitional forms. What's disputed is exactly where they fit in phylogenies. It's like Australopithecus afarensis. Some scientists think it might be directly ancestral to Homo sapiens, but most think that's very unlikely. But neither group thinks that makes it not a transitional species. And remember, ICR has internal disputes and disputes between themselves and other creationists. If we can use internal disputes in a field to say that field is simply entirely wrong about its basic ideas, then what does that say about young Earth creationism? Well, it's nothing good, I'll say that.
So there really aren't. You'd expect to see, if evolution is true, animals of all types just slowly changing.
Well, no, not of every type, because many types of animals almost never fossilize because they're small and squishy, or because they live in places that almost never preserve fossils, like forests. But we do see many superb evolutionary sequences, whether it be proboscideans, equids, ceratopsians, hominins, sirenians, thyrophorans, tyrannosauroids, sauropods, or birds. We
see a lot of variation.
Right.
There's
see that today.
over 1,000 dinosaurs named, but there's really only about 60 kinds.
I love how he says that like it's an established fact, when he can't even say what criteria could possibly delineate how many kinds there are in Dinosauria. There's a reason why basically everyone who ever responds to creationists points out that their idea of kinds is utterly incoherent and meaningless. It's because it's so fundamental to everything they talk about in terms of biology, and yet it's completely meaningless. And you might push back by pointing out that the idea of species is also ill-defined and arbitrary. But the difference is that fundamentally, species designations are there to help humans talk about organisms, not because they need to reflect some aspect of reality, which they don't. But what does reflect an aspect of reality for both creationists and biologists is the concept of clades. Clades are a group of organisms that share a common ancestor, and that common ancestor and all of its descendants. But for the creationist, a kind is a special sort of clade, a clade which is not a member of any higher clade. But the problem is that the way you establish ancestry within a supposed kind is exactly the way that biologists establish ancestry between these supposed kinds anyway. And further, which clades get crowned as kinds is entirely arbitrary, even though it's supposed to be an objective real category in the world. For example, humans and chimpanzees are far more genetically similar than rats and mice, and yet rats and mice are frequently lumped into the same kind, the murid kind, by creationists. Whereas for entirely non-biological reasons, humans and chimps are put in separate kinds. In fact, often chimps are lumped into a kind with gorillas and orangutans, even though they are more similar to humans than to either of those other apes. Further, the very fact that kinds cannot be established in any objective way rather shows that the goal of creationism isn't the furtherance of human knowledge. It isn't scientific progress. It's entirely an apologetics endeavor. The goal is to get people to believe their theology or keep people believing it, regardless of what's true or correct. That's probably why so many professional creationists will blithely say things that are just factually wrong.
There's just a lot of variety. Just like you and I look different, most humans look different. Even if you're a twin, you generally there's something that you can tell, look a little bit different. So just like, most of God's created animal world, there's variation and variety everywhere.
Get on with it. Yes, get on with it.
Get on with it!
And so we see all these fossils, and they name them all new species because they're slightly different.
Clary discovers that the morphospecies concept isn't the same as other species concepts. More at 11. Turns out there isn't one single objectively right species concept, and most species concepts can't be applied to paleotaxa. But who cares? Species are just names humans use to help them talk about organisms.
And so if you were to find, poodles and St. Bernards and any dog breed, which are all the same species.
Right.
But only by convention. Different dog breeds actually meet some of the definitions for different species by some species concepts, like the ecospecies concept or the morphospecies concept. It's just a human convention to call them the same species, or to even make them the same species as the wolf. In fact, they originally were not given the same species as the gray wolf. The gray wolf has always been Canis lupus, but for a long time the domesticated dog was C. familiaris. But then, more recently, it was decided that domesticated groups of organisms should have a subspecies name to indicate their domestic nature and be subsumed under the name of their wild ancestors. So dogs are now C. lupus familiaris, and Felis catus is now Felis sylvestris catus. Why is this? Because fundamentally, species are not real, they're arbitrary. What's real are clades, and the discussion about whether or not paleospecies should actually be a single species or not doesn't really matter. But remember, that's not what kinds are supposed to be. They're supposed to be non-arbitrary, objective groups of organisms that were created as such by God. So no amount of complaining about the lack of consistencies with species will matter, because it's just a tu quoque fallacy. But even then, it's not even a good one.
Any dog breed, if you found their bones, they would all be called different species because they look quite different from one another, but yet they have the same general shape.
Yep, probably true.
Yeah.
But that's how dinosaurs and most fossils are named.
Okay, but dogs aren't a good comparison in this case. No wild animals are as morphologically diverse while being even close to something we normally call the same species. Let's look at the wild diversity in wolves. Look at a timber wolf, a Eurasian wolf, and an Arabian wolf. This is a normal amount of morphological diversity for a species. Dogs are weirdos who were created by humans wanting weird wolves. Even if we look at some dog groups that are not the result of intentional breeding, we find a lot less morphological diversity. Here's an American Carolina dog, an Indian pariah dog, and an Australian dingo. All dogs that are the product of natural selection acting on dogs as animals in close association with humans, but not the product of intentional breeding by humans. Even there, we see a lot less morphological diversity. So unless Clary is suggesting that the majority of named dinosaur species are actually the result of intentional breeding by humans, then there's no reason to compare dogs and dinosaurs in terms of morphological diversity.
But we really don't see anything changing from a dog to some other animal or into a dog.
So Meiosis, Amphicyon, and Hesperocyon, all transitional forms from basal carnivoran to actual canid, but not canine. Those are things that just don't exist, huh? Oh wait, they do exist, and that's exactly what Clary said we don't see, except, we see it.
And we don't know where dinosaurs came from.
Yes, we do. From basal archosauromorphs, like Euparkeria, to basal metatarsalians, like the Aphanosaurs, to dinosauromorphs, like Lagurpitids, to dinosauriformes, like Marsupials, to dracohores, like Silosaurus, to basal dinosaurs, like Herrerasaurus, we have a great transitional sequence for dinosaurs.
There's a big debate of where did dinosaurs, if you're an evolutionist, where did they evolve from?
Okay, I'll do it again. From basal archosauromorphs, like Euparkeria, to basal metatarsalians, like the Aphanosaurs, to dinosauromorphs, like Lagurpitids, to dinosauriformes, like Marsupials, to dracohores, like Silosaurus, to basal dinosaurs, like Herrerasaurus, we have a great transitional sequence for dinosaurs.
We just see things showing up, suddenly fully formed.
Yeah, transitional species are fully formed members of their species. They too were adapted to their niche, and We're not, like, made of melted wax or something. This fully formed nonsense is just that. Nonsense. It doesn't mean anything. It's just a buzzword designed to poison the well against science. You know when animals aren't fully formed? As embryos. And we have fossilized embryos too, so even if Clary wants not fully formed transitional fossils, I guess we have those too. One group of organisms that are fully formed and well adapted to their environment are my patrons. There's a link in the description to my Patreon, and it starts at only $1 a month. You can get a 15% discount for pledging annually, and you get early access to my scripted videos like this one, as well as access to my secret Discord server for supporters only.
Completely, the long necks show up fully formed as long tails, long necks.
Remember earlier when Clary mentioned the dinosaur found off the coast of Norway? Yeah, that was Plateosaurus, a sauropodomorph. That is, transitional between basosauriskians like the aforementioned Herrerasaurus, and later sauropods like Titanosaurus. It wasn't even a full-time quadruped like real sauropods. But hey, let's look at some other transitional sauropods like Saturnalia, Pantidraco, Uniosaurus, Adiopapasaurus, Massospondylus, Unanosaurus, and Jingshanosaurus. That's just a selection of the transitional sauropodomorphs. Only after that do we get to the most basal true sauropods like Volcanodon, which, far from being a giant like we see in the early Cretaceous Titanosaurs, was smaller than an elephant, and by a fair bit too. So even within sauropoda, we have transitional forms. So once again, Clary is just ignoring the fossils, and you can also see why even my more than 70 transitional species in my slideshow is only a tiny fraction of the actual transitional forms we see in the fossil record. If I included all of them, it would just be an hour-long montage of fossils you've never heard of. Now that I think of it, maybe you'd like that.
Mm-hmm. The T-Rexes show up with their teeth and their short arms. They just show up as T-Rexes. There's no animals in the rocks below to show a transition to those animals.
Let's do this. Let's go from basal Coelurosaurus all the way to Tyrannosaurus. Bicentenaria, Zoolong, Juratyran, Guanlong, Eutyrannus, Eotyrannus, Dryptosaurus, Appalachosaurus, Tritophaneus, Albertosaurus, Alioramus, Nanoxaurus, Lithonax, Daspletosaurus, Zoochengtyrannus, and finally Tyrannosaurus. Well, that was pretty easy. I guess creationism is easy when you can just ignore the evidence. Remember, in any given field, creationists tend to ignore about 90% of all relevant data. Clary is just giving us a demonstration of this.
There's no halfway point.
Yeah.
I'm going to glare in Appalachosaurus now.
And that's the way it is to all the rock record.
So the rock record is full of transitional fossils that Tim here is just going to pretend don't exist. Got it.
The most amazing thing to me is and Darwin talked about this, is the Cambrian explosion.
I've heard of it, yes.
I love that Trey is doing his best NPR voice.
And that's where we believe that's some of the first rocks that started to flood the land, bringing in those marine fossils. And we see around the world, we see the initial flooding.
But they just don't have any of the modern animals from those environments, making this whole ecological zonation thing fall apart once again.
And that's
events.
So evolutionists have a problem with the Cambrian explosion for...
No. If you told any evolutionary biologist or paleontologist that they have a problem with the Cambrian explosion, they would be quite surprised to hear that, because the Cambrian presents absolutely no problems for evolution. It does, however, present questions, and those are not the same thing. A question in science is a thing you don't know, but that you'd like to find out about. Like which, if any, of the Ediacaran biota left descendants that have been preserved in the Cambrian. A problem is a reason that some idea in science might be wrong. For example, general relativity and the standard model of particle physics are both robust and extremely accurate models of the way the universe works at the largest and smallest scales. Unfortunately, there is a problem. They're fundamentally incompatible in their current forms. That means one or both of them is wrong about something. We don't know what that is yet, and that's a problem. There are no problems for the theory of evolution in the Cambrian, but there are questions.
From my understanding, it's where all of a sudden we have what we would consider complex life.
Depends on what you mean by complex. I'd say that the Precambrian organisms Dimocalathus and Spergina were complex. Spergina even exhibits what looks like cephalization.
In the record, correct?
Yes, even eyes. The trilobites, have these amazing compound eyes, which baffles the evolutionary world. How do you explain those?
That's so baffling that I'm going to read about how evolution explains it from as far back as I can actually go and still be recognizably within the stream of thought leading to modern evolutionary biology. I'm going to read from The Origin of Species. I'm even going to use the only edition of the book that creationists think exists, the first edition. Quote, "To suppose that the eye, with all its inimitable contrivances for adjusting the focus to different distances for emitting different amounts of light and for the correction of spherical and chromatic aberration could have been formed by natural selection seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest degree possible. Yet reason tells me that if numerous gradients from a perfect and complex eye to one very imperfect and simple, each grade being useful for its possessor, can be shown to exist, if further the eye does vary ever so slightly and the variations be inherited, which is certainly the case, and if any variation or modification in the organ be ever useful to an animal under changing conditions of life, then the difficulty of believing that a perfect and complex eye could be formed by natural selection, though inseparable by our imagination, can hardly be considered real. How a nerve comes to be sensitive to light hardly concerns us more than how life itself first originated. But I may remark that several facts make me suspect that any sensitive nerve may be rendered sensitive to light, and likewise to those coarser vibrations of the air which produce sound. To summarize how it goes, we go from diffuse photosensitive cells, to such cells in patches, to such cells in a shallow cup, to such cells covered by a pinhole, to a bit of transparent stuff at the pinhole, and now we're at a trilobite eye. The only thing unique about trilobite eyes is that they use calcite as a lens, which as far as I know is unique within the animal kingdom. Further, it takes less than 400,000 years to go from nothing to a functioning camera eye, according to the worst-case scenario estimates by Dan E. Nilsson and Suzanne Pelger in their 1994 paper, A Pessimistic Estimate of the Time Required for an Eye to Evolve, published in the Proceedings of the Royal Society, and trilobites don't show up in the Cambrian until some 20 million years into the Cambrian. So they had time to develop eyes from scratch more than 50 times over. So while we don't know exactly what all the steps were that led to trilobite eyes, that's a question, not a problem.
Lately, the evolutionary community has been trying to downplay the Cambrian explosion, saying, it's not really an explosion.
Well, the Cambrian did take some 50 million years, and generally, anything that takes that long isn't really much of an explosion. Indeed, there's even evident evolution within that time frame.
But it really is.
Yeah, well, that's just like your opinion, man.
I mean, even in their time scale, it's, they're saying, well, it took millions of years, but...
Tens of millions of years.
For them, that's a blink in their eye.
Eyes that could have evolved more than 125 times over during that period. The Cambrian wasn't a blink of the eye. Even if we do that whole thing where we pretend that the history of Earth is a day, 50 million years is still 16 seconds. If instead we pretend that the whole of the Phanerozoic, that is more or less the fossil-bearing strata of the Earth, are the day, then the Cambrian is more than 2 hours. That's a lot of evolution of macroscopic life.
And so it really is. Suddenly there's all forms of life. Almost every animal phyla just shows up instantly all over the world in the Cambrian rocks.
Except that's not true, because members of the stem phyla show up first. That is, things that are close to being in a modern phylum, but aren't quite. One of the most famous examples is probably Anomalocaris, a stem arthropod. It's clearly related to arthropods with its segmented body, with paired limbs, and even tagmentization. All hallmarks of arthropoda. But its limbs aren't segmented, another key aspect of arthropoda, which puts it just outside arthropoda. So no, the phyla don't just show up without transitional forms. They too have transitional forms. And of course, the various phyla which show up in the Cambrian, which isn't all of them by the way, some like Rotifera and Virozoa don't show up until much later, don't show up all at once. For example, chordates don't show up until some 25 million years into the Cambrian, about halfway through.
So it really is this explosion.
I guess if the gradual evolution of modern phyla among stem groups over the course of some 50 million years is an explosion, then yes, it was an explosion.
And we explain that as flood geologists, as that's the first major advances of the seas as they start to flood the land.
Right.
It didn't flood everything. Again, there's a progressive flood.
It just managed to miss all the crabs, lobsters, flounders, marine reptiles, and marine mammals. For some reason. I guess pre-flood the lobsters lived on mountains, something I'm sure Jordan Peterson would find very compelling and illuminating about human nature.
Boy, we start seeing these initial marine fossils. So, of course, you're going to see representatives of every major phyla.
It's phylum. The plural is phyla. But also, no, we don't. As I already noted, there are animal phyla that don't show up in the Cambrian. And I guess Clary could say that they're just not major, but that doesn't mean anything, except that he's using major as a weasel word.
Because you're washing those, what's down in the ocean, and suddenly burying them on land in a bunch of sediment. So you see a complete ecosystem right off the bat.
Just one that entirely lacks modern inhabitants of the same ecosystem that we have now. Weird how that doesn't seem to correspond at all to an ecological zone, but it does correspond well to a model in which the biota of different time periods change through deep time. The kind of model that science actually uses. Because it actually accounts for all the data, not just the 10% or so that creationists like to cherry pick.
And that's exactly below that. They've studied and studied and studied. They try to find it. The trilobite is a big critter that's found, an arthropod, in the Cambrian.
Right.
Eventually, remember, they weren't there at first.
And they look below that to try to find ancestors to those. And they have done concerted efforts looking, and they find nothing.
Well, Sprigina is at least a possibility. It's not clear if it's actually a panarthropod, but it certainly could be, and it sure does look a lot like what you might expect the ancestor of a trilobite to look like. So while it's not a surefire transitional, it's also not nothing. Of course, even if we didn't have anything that could reasonably be ancestral or close to ancestral to trilobites, that doesn't negate the transitional sequences that we do have, and one transitional sequence is a falsification of separate ancestry and special creation. We have many, but not all of them that have ever existed.
There's nothing like a trilobite in the rocks below. Below the Cambrian, which we think is the bottom rock layers mostly of the initial sequence that floods the land, that the Sauk sequence we call it.
The Sauk sequence he mentioned is the Sauk-Cratonic sequence in North America. It's a record of a Cambrian period sea transgression where the sea levels were high and large sections of what is now North America were underwater, including the area that is now the Grand Canyon. It is characterized by low-energy rocks such as fine-grained shale and sandstone with tidal crossbedding, the kind of thing that cannot form under a flood. Just the rocks he's talking about completely refute the whole idea of flood geology. There is simply nothing to flood geology. It's just a joke.
Below that, there's really nothing besides just a few, what could be earliest flood sediments in a few places called Ediacaran fossils.
You know, like Sprigina.
And then below that, it's mostly just algae, stromatolites and things that build up these algal-type mounds that built up almost like a bacteria.
So almost like bacteria, that they are bacteria. Stromatolites still grow in some places, famously in Shark Bay, Australia, and guess what? They're photosynthetic bacteria. Can this guy not get one thing right about anything?
And there's really very little in terms of animal fossils at all in the rock record.
Well, unless you count those 800 million year old sterines that are characteristic of poriferans, meaning that at least sponges and presumably box jellies had evolved by then. But being very fragile and soft-bodied, we shouldn't be surprised that we don't see any body fossils of either.
It all kind of starts at just before the Cambrian in a few places in what's called the Ediacaran, which we think might be the initial flood effects.
Am I having deja vu? Didn't he already say this? Am I just going crazy here?
I feel like I'm taking crazy pills!
And then that suddenly you get that explosion of life when you start to really flood the land and bring in these animals.
I love how the Cambrian is supposed to have been when the flood first comes on shore, and yet it has exactly zero terrestrial organisms in it at all. Here's the thing about tsunamis. They tend to hit the animals on land right off the bat. So that makes even less sense than I thought when I thought it was supposed to be just aquatic animals buried underwater. Amazing how creationism can be even stupider than I think it is, given that I think it's about on par with the flat Earth.
Called the Cambrian explosion, which is the initial Sauk sequence.
Right.
Which we think that really marks the beginning of the flood.
Okay.
So what, the Ediacaran was just a fake-out flood god pulled as a goof? Like, what does that actually mean?
So then, personal question here. What is the, below the Cambrian explosion, that Precambrian, is the assumption then that those were also buried in like the flood itself, like in the very earliest stages? It's not...
Does Trey not know what a personal question is?
Some of, in selected locations, we're seeing that. We're trying to keep track of that in the research I'm doing. We're trying to keep track of the pre-Sauk sequence or the Precambrian sediments. And unfortunately, a lot of those sediments got kind of cooked in the process of the flood and the plates moving around.
They're pretty
and
low
so
in the sequence, right?
Some of those become metamorphic rocks.
Right.
And they get distorted.
I have no idea what the relevance of this is. Were the Ediacaran rocks flood rocks or not? This should be pretty easy to say. It's not like you can't tell what a metamorphic rock was before it was metamorphosed, at least in many cases.
And so eventually we kind of lose the record, but we can still see some fossils. Most of them are, algae or bacteria type fossils, the stromatolites. We see those quite commonly.
You want to guess where stromatolites grow? Well, based on what Clary's model says, you'd think that they would be fairly deep in the ocean. Except no. They have to grow near the surface because they need the light of the sun to photosynthesize. So they are actually entirely very shallow marine organisms, even today. Which means those stromatolites also completely debunk the ecological zonation idea that Clary loves so much. Honestly, I'm kind of embarrassed by just how dumb these ideas are, partly on behalf of Clary and his fellow creationists, but also partly for myself as a former young Earth creationist.
There's a little bit of what's called the Ediacaran, where we see some strange-looking animal-like things or maybe plant-like things.
Much of which are ironically deeper water organisms based on the sediment they're in than the earlier stromatolites. So we're going backwards with ecological zonation here.
But they almost kind of look like plants, but I think they're technically animals.
It's a bit contentious, but yeah, that's the consensus. Although I'd say it's a weak consensus.
And those are only in selected locations around the world, so we don't, you've got little bits and pieces.
Yep, we don't have a lot of Ediacaran fossils. But that's where we're going to call it for today. Clary is driving me a bit crazy, and because this is scripted, you get to see the somewhat illusory, calm, normal Dapper. In reality, just in the last quarter of scripting of this video, I've had to get up more than once to go take a break, or in one case, yell a curse word at nothing, just to release all the tension from dealing with this much stupidity and dishonesty. Oh well, if you enjoyed this video, please hit like and tell me what you liked in the comments. If you didn't, then hit dislike and let me know what the problem was. Either way, please subscribe if you haven't, and turn on all notifications so that occasionally YouTube might tell you about my content if they feel like it, regardless of your wishes. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Before you go, I'd like to just take a second to thank my channel members and patrons, especially those pledging $20 or above. Benthoven, Philrevava, Tapioca Weasel, Whispers, Ellerhan Teller, Horseflesh, Ian Chen, Kelvin Brostick Van Manen, Landon Knoll, Mabdy Babdy, Sphincter of Doom, Vollus, North Texas Fossils, John Ackerman, Strawberry Vein, and Dr. Tapioca Weasel. It's because of my channel members and patrons that I'm able to do this show as I am now with 3 videos a week. Without them, I would be reduced to maybe 1 a week, or maybe even 1 every other week. So, if you like this channel and you'd like to support, there's a link to the Patreon in the description, and a join button below this video. All channel members and patrons get early access to videos, often many months in advance, as well as access to my super secret Discord server that's just for supporters and is a great way to contact me. Thanks for watching.